In ancient China, there was a philosopher so feared that emperors banned his writings for 2,000 years. Not because he advocated violence, not because he preached rebellion, but because he revealed the one mechanism of power so effective, so invisible, that those in control couldn't risk you knowing it existed. His name was Han Fei, and he died in prison, murdered by the very emperor he advised, precisely because that emperor understood the teaching too well. What he discovered wasn't a strategy. It was a law of human nature. And once you see it, you can't unsee how it governs every relationship, every organization, every hierarchy you've ever been part of. I want you to sit with that for a moment. A man so dangerous that his ideas had to be erased. Not his actions, his ideas. Because what Han Fei understood about power was so fundamentally true, so universally applicable, that anyone who grasped it could reshape the world around them without anyone noticing until it was already done. And here's what makes this even more unsettling. His writings weren't suppressed because they were wrong. They were suppressed because they were right. Undeniably, uncomfortably, dangerously right. Now, you've been conditioned to believe power requires charisma, visibility, and force of personality. That's why you feel exhausted performing influence and confused when it doesn't work. You show up, you speak up, you make yourself known, and yet the outcomes you want keep slipping through your fingers. Meanwhile, there are people around you, quieter people, less impressive people on the surface, who seem to get exactly what they want without ever appearing to try. And you can't figure out how they're doing it. This video is going to reveal Han Fei's hidden rule, and I need to warn you, real power is structural, not personal. It operates through systems, incentives, and invisible design, not through who shouts loudest or who has the most followers or who gives the most inspiring speech. You're going to learn why the need to be seen is actually your greatest weakness, how the most dangerous operators make others believe they are in control, and why letting go of credit is the only way to gain lasting influence that doesn't burn you out or make you vulnerable to attack. This isn't about manipulation. I want to be very clear about that from the start. This is about understanding the architecture of human decision-making. Most advice tells you to build a presence, to be memorable, to make an impression. Han Fei teaches you to build a machine, a system, a set of conditions that makes your desired outcomes inevitable without anyone tracing them back to you. And before you think that sounds cold or calculating, let me ask you something. Would you rather spend your entire life exhausting yourself trying to convince people, or would you rather create conditions where people convince themselves? Let me take you back to the court of Qin, around 230 BCE. This is where everything I'm about to tell you crystallized into something I could finally understand. There were two ministers who served the same emperor, and on the surface, they couldn't have been more different in their approach to power. The first minister was everything we're taught to admire. He was brilliant, articulate, constantly visible. He accumulated titles the way some people collect trophies. He hosted elaborate banquets where he made sure everyone in attendance knew exactly what he had accomplished, what favor he held with the emperor, what decisions had his fingerprints on them. He was building what we would today call a personal brand. He wanted everyone to know he mattered. The second minister was different. He held one position, seemingly modest, seemingly administrative. He controlled the flow of information to the throne. That's it. He didn't make grand speeches. He didn't host parties. He didn't accumulate visible symbols of status. But here's what he did. He decided what the emperor saw, when the emperor saw it, and how it was framed. Every report that reached the throne passed through his hands first. Every complaint, every piece of intelligence, every recommendation from the provinces. He didn't change the content. He didn't need to. He simply controlled the sequence, the timing, the context. Within 2 years, the first minister was dead, executed for treason, accused by other advisors, investigated by the emperor's officials, found guilty of crimes that may or may not have been real. And here's the thing that should make your blood run a little cold. The second minister never made a single accusation himself. He didn't have to. He had built a system where others did his work for him, where suspicions arose naturally, where evidence accumulated in ways that felt organic, inevitable. He shaped what people saw, and they drew their own conclusions. Conclusions that happened to align perfectly with his interests. The second minister lived a long life, died peacefully, was mourned as a faithful servant of the empire. And almost nobody knew what he had actually done, because what he had done was invisible. He hadn't fought for power. He had designed the conditions under which power flowed toward him. Han Fei observed this pattern over and over again across dynasties, across cultures, across every center of power he studied. And what he concluded was this: visible power attracts envy and attack. The moment you're seen as powerful, you become a target. Every ambitious person in your vicinity starts calculating how to either use you or remove you. Every rival starts planning. Every insecure leader starts seeing you as a threat. Your visibility is your vulnerability. But invisible power? Invisible power shapes the battlefield itself. It determines what questions get asked, what options appear on the table, what feels possible and what feels impossible. And the person wielding it doesn't need to be in the room when the decision gets made, because they've already structured the decision long before anyone sits down to discuss it. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. This sounds like manipulation. It sounds like deceit. It sounds like the kind of thing that compromises your integrity or turns you into someone you don't want to be. And I understand that resistance. I felt it too. For years, I operated on the assumption that good ideas should win on their merits, that truth and clarity and moral correctness were their own form of power. I believed that if I just explained things well enough, if I just made my case clearly enough, people would see what I saw and act accordingly. And I watched, confused and increasingly bitter, as that approach failed again and again. Not because my ideas were wrong, not because I wasn't articulate enough, but because I didn't understand how human beings actually make decisions. I thought we were rational creatures who evaluated information objectively and chose the best path forward. Han Fei knew better. He knew we're pattern recognition machines running on emotion, status anxiety, self-interest, and social proof. We don't evaluate ideas in a vacuum. We evaluate them in context. And whoever controls the context controls the outcome. Let me give you a metaphor that helped me understand this. Imagine a river carving through a mountain over thousands of years. The water doesn't fight the stone. It doesn't try to be harder than the stone or more solid than the stone. It moves around the stone consistently, patiently, reshaping the landscape one molecule at a time over centuries. If you looked at a single moment, you'd think the stone was winning. The stone looks powerful, solid, immovable, permanent. The water looks weak, yielding, insubstantial. But the water decides where the valley goes. The water determines the shape of the landscape. And when you come back 1,000 years later, the stone is in pieces and the water is still flowing, still reshaping, still doing exactly what it was always doing. And here's the crucial part. When you look at that valley, when you walk through that canyon, you don't think about the water. You just see the path. It feels natural. It feels like that's just how the geography is. You don't attribute agency to the water. The water is invisible in its victory. Han Fei's insight was exactly this. Most people try to be the stone. Hard, visible, dominating space. Try to win through force or presence or unmovable conviction. But the truly dangerous ones become the water. They don't confront resistance. They design the conditions where resistance becomes irrelevant. They don't demand compliance. They make compliance feel natural, chosen, inevitable. They don't win arguments. They shape what arguments are possible. And when the valley is carved, when the outcome is achieved, no one remembers the water. They only see the path, and they walk it believing they chose it themselves. So if visible power is a trap and force creates resistance, what's the alternative? How do you actually build influence that lasts, that doesn't exhaust you, that makes others move without knowing they've been moved? That's what I want to break down for you now, because this is where Han Fei's philosophy becomes practical, becomes something you can use tomorrow. The first principle, and this is going to sound paradoxical until you really think about it, is this: you gain control by giving it away. Not randomly, not naively, structurally. When you create systems where others' self-interest aligns with your goals, you don't need to convince anyone of anything. They convince themselves. And this changes everything about how you approach influence. Most people fail at influence because they try to change minds directly. They make arguments, present evidence, appeal to reason or emotion, trying to overwrite someone else's existing beliefs with their own. And this is exhausting. It's exhausting because you're fighting against every cognitive bias, every defensive mechanism, every bit of identity and ego that person is wrapped up in their current position. You're essentially asking them to admit they were wrong and you were right. Even when you're factually correct, even when your position is objectively better. That's a bitter pill. People resist it instinctively. The powerful don't do this. They don't try to change minds. They change incentives. They redesign the game so that what they want becomes what others want. And this isn't manipulation in any sinister sense. It's architecture. You're not lying to people. You're not deceiving them. You're clarifying what already motivates them and creating pathways where following their own motivation leads them to the outcome you desired all along. Let me give you a concrete example from my own life. There was a period when I was trying to implement a particular strategy in an organization I advised. I believed deeply that this strategy was correct, that it would lead to better outcomes, that it was the rational choice. So I made my case. I presented data. I gave speeches. I wrote memos. I appealed to the leadership's stated values. And I got nowhere. Not because they disagreed with my analysis, but because adopting my strategy would require admitting that the current strategy, which several of them had championed, wasn't working. I was asking them to lose face. So I stopped. I stopped arguing. Instead, I started asking questions in meetings. What would success look like in this area? What obstacles are preventing us from getting there? If we could redesign this from scratch, what would we do differently? I wasn't presenting my strategy anymore. I was guiding them through a thought process where my strategy would emerge as the logical conclusion of their own reasoning. And then I did something that felt, at the time, almost painful. When someone articulated a piece of my strategy in response to my questions, I treated it as their insight. I praised it. I asked them to elaborate. I let them take credit for it in front of the group. And slowly, meeting by meeting, my entire strategy was adopted piece by piece, with the leadership team believing they had developed it themselves. They didn't feel like they were admitting failure. They felt like they were innovating. Was this manipulative? I struggled with that question for a while. But here's what I came to understand. My goal wasn't personal glory. It was the outcome. And the outcome was achieved with far less resistance, far more buy-in, and far greater sustainability than if I had forced it through on the strength of my own arguments. The people implementing it believed in it, because as far as they were concerned, it was their idea. They had ownership, and ownership is far more powerful than compliance. This is what Han Fei meant by structural control. You're not controlling people. You're controlling the architecture within which they make decisions. And when you do this well, it's not only more effective than direct persuasion, it's also more ethical, because you're working with people's genuine motivations rather than against them. The second principle is what I call strategic invisibility, and this is where most people who understand power intellectually still fail in practice, because it requires something that goes against every modern instinct we've been trained to have. The principle is this: the moment you're seen as the source of an idea, half the room starts resisting. Not because the idea is bad, but because human beings are wired to protect autonomy. We don't like feeling like we're being told what to do, even when what we're being told is beneficial to us. It triggers something defensive in us, something that says, if I accept this person's idea, I'm subordinating myself to them. I'm admitting they're smarter or more capable or higher status than me. Han Fei understood this completely. He watched it play out in every court, every negotiation, every power struggle. The advisor who spoke most confidently, who put his name on every proposal, who made sure everyone knew it was his thinking that led to success, that advisor never lasted long. Because even when he was right, even when his advice led to victories, he had made himself threatening. He had made the leader feel dependent. And leaders don't like feeling dependent. It makes them insecure. And insecure leaders remove the source of their insecurity. So Han Fei advocated for something radical. Let others take credit. Let them believe it was their insight their intelligence, their decision. Your ego will scream that this is weakness, that you're being used, that you'll never get recognition for your contributions. And your ego is wrong, because recognition is a short-term drug that leads to long-term vulnerability. The leader who needs recognition has influence for a season. The advisor who shapes the leader's thoughts has influence for a lifetime. This is why emperors feared their best advisors. Not because those advisors betrayed them or schemed against them, but because they understood how to become essential without becoming visible. They understood how to make themselves indispensable to the decision-making process while ensuring the decision-maker always felt like they were in control. In that combination, being essential while appearing subordinate, that's the most dangerous position you can occupy, because you can't be removed without cost, but you also don't trigger the defensive mechanisms that come with visible power. I want you to think about someone in your life who has this quality. Probably not someone famous. Probably not someone with an impressive title. But someone who, when you really look at how decisions get made in their environment, somehow always ends up getting their way without appearing to fight for it. They're not the loudest voice in a meeting. They're not the one giving orders. But afterward, when you look at what got decided, it's somehow aligned with what they wanted. They have an almost eerie ability to guide outcomes without leaving fingerprints. What they've understood is that influence and visibility are not the same thing. In fact, they're often inversely related. The more visible your influence, the more resistance it generates. The more invisible your influence, the more freely it flows. And this is deeply counterintuitive in an age that tells you to build a personal brand, to be seen, to make sure you get credit, to establish yourself as a thought leader. All of that advice is optimizing for the wrong thing. It's optimizing for recognition, not for outcomes. And if you care more about outcomes than recognition, you need to be willing to operate differently. The third principle is what Han Fei called the law of inevitable outcomes. And this is where his philosophy becomes almost mathematical in its precision. The idea is simple but profound. Power isn't about forcing outcomes. It's about making outcomes inevitable. You don't push the boulder uphill. You place it at the top and remove the obstacles. You design the slope. You let gravity do the work. In practice, this means instead of persuading someone to act, you create conditions where not acting costs them more than acting. Instead of demanding loyalty, you design situations where loyalty serves their interest. You're not fighting against human nature. You're working with it. You're aligning your goals with the natural incentives and pressures that already exist in the system. Let me give you an example that I think will make this concrete. Imagine you're trying to get your team to adopt a new process. The traditional approach is to explain why the new process is better, to make a case for it, to maybe even mandate it from above if you have the authority. And what happens? People comply minimally. They find workarounds. They wait for you to stop paying attention so they can revert to the old way. Because you've asked them to change, which feels like work, like sacrifice, like admitting the old way wasn't good enough. The Han Fei approach is completely different. You start by observing what people already complain about in the current process. What frustrates them? What wastes their time? What makes them look bad to their own stakeholders? And then you design the new process specifically to solve those pain points. You don't present it as your innovation. You present it as a solution to their problems. Better yet, you involve them in designing it so that by the time it's ready to implement, they see it as their solution, not yours. And here's the key move. You make adoption the path of least resistance. You make the new process easier than the old process. You remove friction. You provide support. You celebrate early adopters not for adopting the new thing, but for solving the problems they already wanted to solve. And suddenly, without any force, without any mandate, adoption spreads. Not because you convinced anyone, but because you made the outcome inevitable. You aligned the new process with existing incentives and removed the obstacles to adoption. This is what Han Fei meant when he said the wise ruler governs through non-action. He doesn't mean doing nothing. He means designing systems that function without constant intervention. He means creating conditions where the right behaviors emerge naturally because they're the rational response to the incentive structure. And once you start seeing power this way, as architecture rather than performance, as system design rather than personal charisma, everything changes. You stop exhausting yourself trying to be impressive. You stop feeling frustrated when people don't immediately see the brilliance of your ideas. You stop taking it personally when there's resistance, because you understand that resistance is information. It's telling you where the incentives aren't aligned yet, where the path isn't smooth enough yet, where you need to redesign rather than push harder. Now, here's the fourth principle, and this is the one that makes people most uncomfortable, but it's also the one that separates people who understand Han Fei academically from people who can actually apply his insights in the real world. The principle is this: you have to be comfortable with contradiction. You have to be able to hold seemingly opposite truths at the same time without needing to resolve them into a single, clean, morally simple framework. Han Fei understood that morality and power operate on different planes. You could be ethical and strategic, invisible and principled, caring and calculating. These aren't contradictions. They're different dimensions of the same reality. The mistake people make is thinking that influence requires purity of method, that if you're using strategic thinking, you must be compromising your ethics. That's not true. What you're doing is acknowledging how things actually work rather than how you wish they worked. You can care deeply about people while understanding how they actually function. That's not cynicism. That's compassion through realism. It's actually more respectful to work with people's genuine motivations than to pretend they should be motivated by what you think they should be motivated by. When you try to influence someone by appealing to pure reason or abstract principle while ignoring what actually drives their behavior, you're not being more ethical. You're being less effective and, arguably, less honest about human nature. Let me give you an example that might clarify this. I once worked with a leader who was genuinely committed to equity and inclusion in his organization. Noble goal, morally correct. But his approach was to make passionate speeches about why diversity was the right thing to do, appealing to people's better angels, asking them to examine their biases and change their behavior out of moral conviction. And it didn't work. Not because people disagreed with the goal, but because asking them to act out of guilt or moral obligation felt like an accusation. It made them defensive, so we changed the approach. We stopped talking about diversity as a moral imperative and started talking about it as a competitive advantage. We presented data showing that diverse teams made better decisions, that inclusive environments attracted better talent, that companies with strong diversity metrics outperformed their competitors financially. We tied inclusion to metrics that leaders already cared about: innovation, retention, profitability, market share. We made it in their self-interest to care about something that was also morally right. Was this manipulative? Or was it strategic? Was it compromising the moral imperative of inclusion to frame it in terms of business outcomes? Or was it being realistic about how to actually achieve the outcome rather than just feeling good about having the right values? This is the kind of contradiction you have to be comfortable with. The goal was ethical. The method was strategic. And the result was more inclusion, more equity, more real change than years of moral appeals had achieved. Han Fei would say this isn't a contradiction at all. It's just understanding that humans respond to incentives, and wise leaders design incentives that align with good outcomes. You're not being cynical about people by acknowledging their self-interest. You're being realistic. And realism, properly applied, achieves more good in the world than idealism that refuses to work with human nature as it actually is. So those are the 4 core principles. Gain control by giving it away structurally. Embrace strategic invisibility. Make outcomes inevitable rather than forced. And be comfortable holding contradictions. Now, if you're still with me, you might be thinking, okay, this all makes sense in theory, but how do I actually practice this? What does invisible power look like in my day-to-day life, in my relationships, in the places where I actually need influence? Let me give you 4 practices you can start immediately. These aren't abstract. These are things you can test this week and see results. Practice number 1. For the next 7 days, stop giving advice directly. Just stop. When someone comes to you with a problem, instead of telling them what you think they should do, ask them questions that guide them toward the conclusion you already see. What do you think would happen if you tried this approach? How have you seen similar situations resolved in the past? What's keeping you from taking the action you think might work? And then watch. Watch how much more readily people adopt ideas they believe they discovered. Watch how much less resistance there is when you're not positioned as the expert telling them what to do. This is uncomfortable at first because it feels slower, it feels less efficient, it feels like you're not being helpful. But that's your ego talking. Your ego wants the credit for being smart, for having the answer, for being the one who solved the problem. But if your actual goal is to help the person, to create change, to achieve an outcome, guiding them to their own insight is far more powerful than handing them yours. Because they'll actually implement an insight they believe they had. They'll defend an idea they think is theirs. They'll persist through obstacles when they feel ownership. I had a friend who came to me years ago with a career dilemma. She was miserable in her job, but terrified to leave because of financial security. The old version of me would have analyzed her situation and told her exactly what I thought she should do. The new version asked questions. What would your life look like in 5 years if you stayed? What's the worst realistic outcome if you made a change? What advice would you give to someone else in your exact situation? Within an hour, she had talked herself into a decision. She left that job within 3 months. And to this day, she describes it as the best decision she ever made, one she's proud she had the courage to make. She doesn't remember that I guided her there. She remembers that she figured it out. And because of that, it stuck. Practice number 2. Control the frame, not the content. In your next meeting or significant conversation, don't argue your position. Instead, shape what gets discussed. Set the agenda. Define the problem. Decide what information enters the room and in what order. You'll find that you barely need to speak. Others will argue your case for you because you've defined the boundaries of the conversation in a way that makes your preferred outcome the logical conclusion. This is one of the most powerful techniques I've ever learned, and it's almost completely invisible when it's done well. Let me give you an example. I was once in a situation where I needed a team to allocate more resources to a particular project. If I had argued for it directly, there would have been immediate pushback about competing priorities, budget constraints, all the usual resistance. So instead, I requested a meeting to discuss resource allocation strategy going forward. I defined the problem as, we need to identify which initiatives are most critical to our stated goals for the next quarter. Then I made sure the agenda included reviewing our stated goals first, which everyone had already agreed to in a previous meeting. Once those goals were on the table, I asked the team to evaluate current projects against those goals. Which initiatives most directly served what we had already committed to. And suddenly, without me advocating for anything, it became obvious to everyone in the room that the project I cared about was under-resourced relative to its importance to our shared goals. The team argued for increasing its resources. I barely said anything except to facilitate the conversation. Did I manipulate them? Or did I create clarity? I think it's the latter. I removed the noise and politics and ego and helped everyone see the situation clearly. And because they reached the conclusion themselves, there was no resistance, no resentment, no sense that they'd been overruled or convinced against their will. The frame did all the work. The content took care of itself. Practice number 3, and this one is going to hurt. Let go of one victory. Identify one place where you need to be right, to be recognized, to get credit. One place where your ego is invested in people knowing that you were the smart one, the one who saw it first, the one who made it happen. And deliberately let someone else have it. Give away the credit. Let them be the hero of that story. And then watch what happens to your influence in that space over the next month. What you'll discover is paradoxical, but true. The loss of ego is the beginning of power. When you stop needing credit, you stop generating resistance. People start trusting you more because you're clearly not playing a status game. They start seeking your input more because you're not threatening. And gradually, quietly, you become essential to how decisions get made precisely because you're not trying to be visible in those decisions. I know someone who practiced this in his family business. He's the middle sibling, not the oldest, not the youngest, working alongside his brothers in a company their father built. For years, he fought to be recognized for his contributions, to have his ideas taken seriously, to get credit when things went well. And it created constant tension. His older brother felt threatened. His younger brother felt overshadowed. Family dinners became competitions. Then he stopped. He stopped advocating for his ideas in meetings. He started asking questions instead. When his older brother presented a strategy, even if it was close to what he had been thinking, he supported it publicly and added refinements in private, framed as helping his brother's idea work better. Within 6 months, his brothers were actively seeking his input on everything. Within a year, he had effectively become the strategic center of the company without holding the title of CEO or president or anything that would bruise egos. He let go of the visible victory and gained the invisible power. In practice number 4, build one invisible system. Create one small process, routine, or structure in your work or home that subtly guides behavior without announcement. It could be how information flows, how decisions get framed, or how options are presented. Don't tell anyone you're doing it. Just observe what happens. This could be as simple as changing the default settings on something, which quietly shifts behavior without anyone making a conscious choice. It could be establishing a routine where certain topics are discussed at certain times, which shapes what people think about when. It could be becoming the person who sends out agendas or meeting notes, which lets you determine what gets remembered and emphasized from every gathering. These sound small, but they're the building blocks of structural power. I started doing this in my own life by becoming the person who suggested restaurants when my friend group went out. Seems trivial, right? But over time, I shaped where we went, what kind of experiences we had together, even what conversations emerged, because certain environments encourage certain kinds of interaction. I never announced I was doing this. I never asked for the role. I just consistently offered suggestions, and people are generally happy to defer to someone who's willing to do the minor cognitive labor of choosing. And through that tiny structural position, I influenced hundreds of hours of shared experience. Now, multiply that principle across more significant domains. The person who writes the first draft of a document controls the frame, even if others edit it later. The person who schedules meetings controls what gets discussed when people are fresh versus when they're tired. The person who decides what gets measured controls what gets valued. These are invisible positions of power, and they're often available to anyone willing to do the work without demanding recognition for it. So those are 4 practices. Ask instead of tell, control the frame, not the content. Let go of one victory and build one invisible system. If you do these 4 things consistently for a month, you will feel a shift in how influence moves through your life. Not because you've become more charismatic or more impressive, but because you've started operating on the structural level rather than the performative level. Now, I want to address something that I know is coming up for some of you, because it came up for me when I first started understanding these principles. There's a voice in your head saying, this feels manipulative. This feels dishonest. This feels like I'm becoming someone I don't want to be. And I want to take that seriously because that's a valid ethical instinct. Here's what I've come to believe. The question isn't whether you're influencing people. You're always influencing people. Your presence, your words, your choices, they all shape the environment around you whether you intend them to or not. The question is whether you're influencing them consciously and skillfully or unconsciously and clumsily. Han Fei's approach isn't about adding manipulation to an otherwise pure interaction. It's about being honest with yourself about the fact that all interaction involves influence and choosing to do it well rather than poorly. Think about it this way. When you try to convince someone of something through pure argument, hoping the force of your logic will overpower their resistance, what are you actually doing? You're trying to impose your will on their thinking. You're trying to make them see things your way. That's not less manipulative than strategic influence. It's just less effective. And because it's less effective, it often requires more force, more pressure, more violation of their autonomy. When you guide someone to an insight through questions, when you shape the decision-making environment so that good choices become obvious, you're actually respecting their agency more, not less. You're working with their natural thought process instead of against it. You're clarifying reality for them instead of trying to overwrite it with your version of reality. And the outcome? They make a decision they genuinely believe in rather than one they've been pressured into. So no, I don't think Han Fei's approach is manipulative in any meaningful ethical sense. I think it's realistic. I think it's effective. And I think it's actually more respectful of human nature than the alternative. But here's the crucial thing. The ethics of these techniques depend entirely on your intent. If you're using strategic influence to achieve outcomes that benefit everyone involved, that align with genuine goods in the world, that's not manipulation. That's leadership. If you're using the exact same techniques to exploit people, to benefit yourself at their expense, to achieve outcomes that harm others, that is manipulation. The technique isn't the ethics. The intent is the ethics. Han Fei himself was ultimately neutral on this question. He was describing how power works, not how it should be used. He believed that understanding these mechanisms was necessary for anyone who wanted to be effective in the world, whether their goals were noble or selfish. And I think he was right about that. The mechanisms of influence are amoral. They're tools. And like any tool, they can be used to build or to destroy, to help or to harm. What I'm asking you to do isn't to become ruthless or cold or calculating in some sociopathic sense. I'm asking you to become skillful, to stop exhausting yourself with ineffective approaches to influence and start using approaches that actually work. To stop letting your ego sabotage your impact. To stop confusing visibility with power and recognition with effectiveness. And to start understanding that the people who actually change things in the world, who actually build things that last, who actually create the outcomes they envision, they've learned to work with human nature as it is, not as they wish it were. Let me bring this full circle by returning to where we started. Han Fei's writings were suppressed for 2,000 years. His ideas were considered too dangerous to be widely known. And the reason wasn't that they were wrong. The reason was that they were true in a way that threatened existing power structures. Because once you understand how power actually works, once you see the mechanisms clearly, you can't unsee them. You start noticing them everywhere. You start seeing how decisions really get made, how influence really flows, how the people who appear to be in charge often aren't, and how the people who never seem to be in charge often are. And that awareness is dangerous to people whose power depends on you not having it. It's dangerous to leaders who rule through charisma instead of competence. It's dangerous to institutions that maintain control through mystique and authority rather than through genuine effectiveness. It's dangerous to anyone whose influence depends on you not understanding the game being played. But here's what I want you to understand. This knowledge isn't just dangerous to others. It's liberating for you. Because once you stop believing that power requires you to be the loudest voice, the most charismatic personality, the most visible presence, you stop trying to be something you're not. You stop exhausting yourself performing influence and start actually having it. You stop caring about credit and start caring about outcomes. And outcomes are what matter. Here's what I've learned in all my years of studying power, of watching it move through courts and boardrooms and families and friendships. The people who actually win, who actually build things that last, who actually change their environments in meaningful ways, they're almost never the people you'd expect. They're not the most impressive people in the room. They're not the best speakers. They're not the ones with the most confidence or the highest titles. They're the ones who understood what Han Fei understood. That power is structural, that influence is architectural, that outcomes are shaped by systems and incentives more than by personality or persuasion. And once you internalize that, once you really let it change how you operate, everything shifts. You stop wasting energy on the wrong things. You stop fighting battles that can't be won through direct confrontation. You stop taking things personally when your ideas aren't immediately adopted, because you understand that adoption isn't about the quality of the idea, it's about the design of the environment in which the idea is introduced. You become patient in a way you weren't before, because you understand that real change happens slowly, through accumulation, through small shifts in incentive structures and decision-making processes. You become invisible in a way that would have terrified your younger self, because you've learned that visibility is a cost, not a benefit. You become comfortable with contradiction in a way that makes you more effective and, paradoxically, more ethical because you're working with reality as it is rather than as you wish it were. I want to share one more story with you before we close, because I think it captures everything I've been trying to communicate. There was a period in my life when I was deeply frustrated with my lack of influence in a particular domain. I had good ideas. I had expertise. I had experience. And yet every time I tried to shape outcomes, every time I made my case, every time I pushed for the changes I knew were necessary, I encountered resistance. People nodded politely and then did nothing. Or worse, they did the opposite just to assert their independence. And I was bitter about it. I felt unappreciated. I felt like my talents were being wasted. I felt like people were being irrational, stubborn, short-sighted. I blamed them for not seeing what I saw. I blamed the system for not rewarding merit. I blamed everything except the one thing I needed to blame: my approach. Then I encountered Han Fei's writings for the first time, and something clicked. I realized I had been operating on completely wrong assumptions about how influence works. I had assumed that being right was enough. That clarity was enough. That good intentions and solid arguments were enough. And none of that was true. Being right without being strategic just means you get to watch, frustrated, while wrong ideas win because they're positioned better. So I changed everything. I stopped making arguments. I started asking questions. I stopped positioning myself as the expert. I started positioning others as the discoverers of solutions I had been trying to give them for years. I stopped trying to get credit. I started giving it away strategically to people whose support I needed. I stopped trying to be impressive. I started trying to be useful in ways that made me essential without making me visible. And within 6 months, every major change I had been advocating for was being implemented. Not because I had convinced anyone, not because I had won any arguments, but because I had redesigned the environment in which decisions were being made. I had aligned incentives. I had removed obstacles. I had made the outcomes I wanted feel inevitable and natural, and like everyone's own idea. The transformation wasn't in the external circumstances. The transformation was in me. I had learned to stop fighting with reality and start working with it. I had learned to stop trying to be powerful and start actually having power. And the difference between those two things, between trying to be powerful and actually having power, that's everything. Because trying to be powerful is exhausting. It requires constant performance, constant self-promotion, constant defense of your position, constant anxiety about whether people recognize your contributions, whether they're giving you enough credit, whether they're taking you seriously. It's a treadmill that never stops. And the moment you step off, the moment you stop performing, your influence evaporates because it was never real. It was always just a show. But actually having power, actually having influence, that's restful. It's sustainable. It doesn't require performance because it's not based on perception. It's based on structure. You've built systems that function whether you're in the room or not. You've aligned incentives that persist whether you're actively managing them or not. You've created conditions that produce the outcomes you want as naturally as water flowing downhill. And you can step back. You can rest. You can let the architecture do its work. This is what Han Fei meant when he talked about governing through non-action. Not that you don't act, but that you act in ways that make future action unnecessary. You build once, and it keeps producing results. You design once, and it keeps shaping behavior. You set things up correctly, and then you could be invisible, unrecognized, seemingly uninvolved, while outcomes that look like luck or coincidence or natural evolution align perfectly with what you intended all along. Now, I want to talk about something that I think is crucial, especially for those of you who have genuinely good intentions, who want to use influence for positive purposes, who care about ethics and integrity. One of the resistances I see when I teach these ideas is this fear that becoming strategic means becoming cold, that understanding power means losing your humanity, that operating invisibly means you're being dishonest. And I want to address this directly because it's not true, but the fear is understandable. There's a version of strategic thinking that is cold. There's a version of power seeking that is dehumanizing. There are people who've learned these principles and use them in ways that are genuinely manipulative, that treat other people as objects to be moved around rather than as humans to be respected. And when you first encounter Han Fei's ideas, they can sound like that's what he's advocating for. Pure calculation, ruthless efficiency, winning at any cost. But that's a misreading. Or more precisely, That's reading Han Fei without wisdom, without context, without the moral framework that determines how you use what you learn. Because Han Fei's insights about human nature, about how decisions get made, about how influence flows, those insights are true regardless of your intentions. They're descriptive, not prescriptive. They tell you how things work. They don't tell you what to do with that knowledge. And here's what I've discovered. You can be strategic and compassionate. You can understand human nature deeply and still respect people profoundly. You can work with people's self-interest while genuinely caring about their well-being. These things are not contradictions. In fact, I'd argue that real compassion requires understanding how people actually function. That real respect means working with someone's genuine motivations rather than insisting they should be motivated by what you think is important. When you try to influence someone by appealing to abstract principle while ignoring what actually drives them, you're not being more ethical. You're being less effective and, arguably, less respectful of their reality. When you design incentive structures that align people's self-interest with good outcomes, you're not manipulating them. You're creating conditions where doing the right thing is also the rational thing. And that's a gift, not a violation. So I want to release you from the false choice between being strategic and being good. You can be both. You should be both. The world needs people who are both. Because the people who understand power but don't care about ethics, they're going to use these principles regardless. The question is whether the people who do care about ethics, who do want good outcomes, who do want to build things that help rather than harm, whether those people are willing to become skillful enough to compete. And make no mistake, you are competing. Not in some petty, zero-sum sense necessarily, but in the sense that influence is finite. Attention is finite. Resources are finite. Decision-making power is finite. And if you refuse to learn how these things actually work because you think understanding power is somehow beneath you or morally compromising, you're not taking the high road. You're just ceding the field to people who have no such qualms. I think that's actually irresponsible. I think if you care about making the world better, if you have visions for how things could be improved, if you have insights that could help people, you have an obligation to become effective at implementing those visions. And effectiveness requires understanding power. It requires understanding influence. It requires learning to work with human nature as it is, not as you wish it were. So embrace the paradox. Be strategic and compassionate. Be invisible and principled. Be effective and ethical. Hold the contradiction without needing to resolve it. Because that's what wisdom looks like in the real world. Not moral purity disconnected from outcomes, but moral purpose connected to skillful action. Let me give you one final principle that I think ties all of this together, and then I want to leave you with something practical you can carry forward. The principle is this: your relationship with power reveals your maturity. Immature people either worship power or reject it entirely. They either become obsessed with accumulating it, treating it as an end in itself, or they pretend they don't want it, treating the whole domain as dirty or beneath them. Both positions are childish. Mature people understand that power is neutral. It's a tool. It's a capacity. And the question isn't whether you'll have it or use it, because you're going to whether you intend to or not. The question is whether you'll develop the skill to use it well and the wisdom to use it for purposes beyond yourself. That's maturity. Not rejecting power, not worshiping it, but developing a healthy, conscious, skillful relationship with it in service of outcomes that matter. And I think that's what Han Fei was ultimately teaching, even though he lived in a brutal time and wrote for rulers who often use his insights for brutal purposes. He was teaching consciousness, awareness, understanding. He was saying, here's how this actually works. Here's what's really happening beneath the surface of every interaction, every decision, every power dynamic. And once you see it, you can't pretend you don't. You have to decide what you're going to do with that knowledge. So what are you going to do with it? That's the question I want to leave you with. Because now you know that visible power is vulnerable power. You know that the need for recognition is a weakness, not a strength. You know that influence flows through structure, not personality. You know that outcomes are shaped by incentives and architecture more than by argument and persuasion. You know that the most dangerous form of power is the power no one sees coming. And you can't unknow that. From this point forward, you're going to see these dynamics everywhere. You're going to notice who's actually influencing decisions versus who's taking credit for them. You're going to see how the quiet person in the meeting often ends up getting their way. You're going to recognize when someone is controlling the frame rather than the content. You're going to spot the difference between people who are trying to be powerful and people who actually are. And the question is, what are you going to do with that awareness? Are you going to keep operating the way you have been, trying to be impressive, fighting for credit, exhausting yourself with direct persuasion? Or are you going to start building differently? Are you going to start thinking structurally? Are you going to start practicing strategic invisibility? Are you going to start making outcomes inevitable rather than fighting to force them? I can't make that choice for you. But I can tell you that the path Han Fei points toward, as uncomfortable as it might feel initially, leads to something you might not expect. Not just effectiveness, not just influence, but freedom. Freedom from the constant need to perform. Freedom from the anxiety about whether you're being recognized. Freedom from the exhaustion of trying to convince people who don't want to be convinced. Freedom to focus on outcomes rather than optics, on results rather than recognition, on building things that last rather than building your personal brand. And that freedom, that shift from performance to presence, from trying to actually being, that's the real gift in all of this. Not the power itself, but the ease that comes with understanding how it actually works. The relief of finally operating in alignment with reality rather than against it. So here's what I want you to remember. Write this down. Carry it with you. Come back to it when you're frustrated, when you're exhausted, when you're wondering why your good ideas aren't gaining traction, when you're tempted to believe that the problem is other people's irrationality rather than your approach. You don't need to be seen to be powerful. You need to be essential. And the most essential people are the ones no one notices until they're gone. Read that again. Feel how it contradicts everything you've been taught about success, about influence, about making your mark on the world. And then ask yourself, have those teachings actually worked for you? Has trying to be visible, trying to be impressive, trying to get credit for everything you do, has that given you the influence you want? Has it created the outcomes you envision? Or has it just made you tired? Because if it's made you tired, if you're exhausted from performing power instead of having it, then maybe it's time to try something different. Maybe it's time to stop being the stone and become the water. Maybe it's time to stop pushing boulders uphill and start placing them at the top. Maybe it's time to stop fighting with reality and start working with it. That shift from performance to structure, from visibility to essence, from trying to prove your value to simply being valuable in ways that make you indispensable. That's not just a strategic shift. It's a philosophical shift. It's a shift in how you understand yourself, how you understand others, how you understand the very nature of influence and impact. And I'm not going to tell you it's easy. It's not. It requires you to sacrifice something you probably didn't even realize you were attached to, the need to be recognized. The need to have people know that you're smart, capable, influential. The need to get credit for your contributions. That need, which feels so natural, so justified, so like a basic human right, that need is what's killing your effectiveness. And letting it go feels like death. It feels like you're erasing yourself. It feels like you're becoming invisible in the worst possible way. But on the other side of that death is something you didn't expect. Actual power. Not the appearance of power. Not the performance of power. But the reality of it. The experience of watching outcomes align with your intentions without anyone knowing you intended them. The experience of being essential without being visible. The experience of influencing everything while claiming nothing. And once you've experienced that, once you've felt what it's like to have real structural power instead of performative power, you'll never want to go back. Because it's sustainable. It's restful. It doesn't require you to be constantly on, constantly performing, constantly defending your territory. You've built systems that work without you. You've aligned incentives that persist without you. You've created conditions that produce the outcomes you want whether you're in the room or not. That's freedom. That's mastery. That's what Han Fei was pointing toward beneath all the talk of rulers and courts and political strategy. He was pointing toward a way of operating in the world that's in harmony with how things actually work, rather than in constant friction with reality. And the people who find that harmony, who stop fighting and start flowing, who stop trying to be powerful and start actually having power, those people change everything around them while appearing to change nothing. They're the water that carves the valley. They're the invisible hand that shapes every outcome. They're the architects of inevitability. And you can be one of them, not because you're special, not because you have some unique gift, but because you're willing to learn. You're willing to let go. You're willing to stop trying to be impressive and start trying to be effective. You're willing to trade recognition for results. You're willing to understand that the most dangerous form of power is the power no one sees coming. And that if you're willing to be dangerous in that way, strategic in that way, invisible in that way, there's almost nothing you can't eventually shape. So that's my challenge to you. That's what I'm asking you to consider. Not whether you want power, because you already have it and you're already using it whether you acknowledge it or not. But whether you want to use it consciously, skillfully, effectively. Whether you want to stop exhausting yourself with approaches that don't work and start building systems that do. Whether you want to trade your ego for your impact. And if you do, if some part of you recognized truth in what we've explored here today, if some part of you felt the relief of finally understanding why your previous approaches to influence haven't worked the way you wanted them to, then I want to hear from you. Leave a comment. Tell me where you've seen these principles at work in your own life. Tell me where you're struggling to let go of the need to be seen. Tell me what resistances are coming up for you as you consider operating this way. Because this isn't just theory. This is lived experience. And the conversation, the community, the exploration of how these ideas apply in real situations with real stakes. That's where the real learning happens. And if you want more of this, if you want to keep exploring the uncomfortable truths, the ancient strategies, the philosophies that actually change how you move through the world rather than just making you feel inspired for a few hours, then subscribe. Because I'm building something here for people who are tired of surface-level advice, who are tired of being told to just be more confident or think more positively or believe in themselves harder. I'm building something for people who want to understand how things actually work, who want to operate with reality, not against it, who want effectiveness, not just inspiration. And here's what I promise you. I will never tell you what you want to hear just to make you feel good. I will tell you what I believe is true, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it contradicts popular wisdom, even when it requires you to let go of beliefs you've built your identity around. Because that's what you need if you actually want to change. Not comfort, not validation, but truth delivered with compassion, offered as a gift from someone who's walked this path and found something real on the other side. You're not broken. You're not failing because you're not good enough or smart enough or charismatic enough. You've just been misled about how influence actually works. You've been taught to optimize for the wrong things, to pursue visibility when you should be building structure, to seek recognition when you should be seeking essence, to try to be powerful when you should be focusing on actually having power. And now you know better. Now you understand the hidden rule, the principle that emperors tried to suppress because it was too true, too effective, too dangerous to be widely known. You understand that real power is invisible, that real influence is structural, that the most dangerous operators are the ones no one sees coming because they've learned to shape outcomes without leaving fingerprints. So stop trying to be seen. Start trying to be essential. Stop trying to get credit. Start trying to get results. Stop fighting with reality. Start working with it. And watch what happens. Watch how your influence grows precisely as your visibility shrinks. Watch how your impact increases precisely as your need for recognition decreases. Watch how you become dangerous in the best possible way. As someone who shapes everything while claiming nothing, who builds systems that outlast them, who creates conditions where good outcomes become inevitable. That's the path Han Fei illuminated 23 centuries ago. That's the hidden rule that still governs every hierarchy, every organization, every power dynamic you'll ever encounter. And now it's yours. Use it wisely. Use it well. Use it in service of something beyond yourself. And become the water that carves the valley, invisible in your victory, essential in your absence, dangerous in ways no one will ever fully understand. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being willing to consider ideas that challenge everything you've been taught. That willingness, that openness, that courage to question and explore and potentially change how you operate in the world. That's rare. That's valuable. And I'm honored to be part of your journey. Now, go build something that lasts. And remember, the people who actually change the world are rarely the ones you see coming. Be one of them.